Welcome to the fourth presentation in the fourth webinar series presented by the International Adsorption Society. The IAS is an international organization dedicated to advancing adsorption as a solution to scientific, engineering, and human welfare challenges through the promotion of adsorption research and education. We thank everyone for attending the webinar today. The webinar series has been an immense success, and the recordings of previous webinars continue to be viewed on YouTube and Bilibili. This is the fourth webinar of our fourth series, which we will continue to have monthly throughout the year. We intend to continue with a variety of speakers from industry, academia, and other research institutes, as well as PhD students and early career researchers. Announcements regarding the fourth series will be distributed through the IAS mailing list and the IAS Twitter feed. Today's webinar will be given by Professor Susana García at Heriot-Watt University in the United Kingdom. I am Nicholas Wilkins at Svante Technologies Incorporated. Today's webinar will be moderated by Bhupesh Murugapan at the University of Alberta. We're required to remind attendees and future viewers that the views expressed by the speaker, host, or other moderators are not necessarily those of the IAS or the institutions associated with those individuals. We ask that you consider joining the IAS as a regular member if you are not already. Our dues are minimal, only $20 per year, but support the publication of our flagship journal, Adsorption, contribute to travel grants, and workshop seed funding for IAS members and affiliated groups, as well as aid the organization of our triennial conference on the fundamentals of adsorption. Members also receive free access to IAS-supported materials, including our journal, as well as the adsorption database published by Springer Materials. Anyone can follow the IAS on Twitter at @intadsots for future updates regarding IAS events, webinars, and information about scientific meetings. Please help us expand our YouTube channel by liking this video and subscribing. I'll now hand it over to Bhupesh, who will moderate the YouTube Q&A.
Thanks, Nick. It is my pleasure to welcome Professor Susana García to today's webinar session. Susana García is Professor of Chemical and Process Engineering and Deputy Head of the Institute of Mechanical, Process, and Energy Engineering at Heriot-Watt University. She is also the Associate Director in Carbon Capture and Storage at the Research Center for Carbon Solutions, RCCS. RCCS is an interdisciplinary energy center, inspiring and delivering innovation for the wider deployment of technologies needed to meet necessary carbon targets. Her current research focuses on advancing materials and separation processes for energy, industrial, and environmental applications. She ambitions to change the paradigm on how novel processes based on advanced materials are developed through the integration of process engineering and basic science. During the webinar, questions can be submitted to the speaker as comments on the YouTube live stream. Questions will be answered at the end of the presentation. With that, I welcome Professor Susana García again and pass over the presentation to her. Professor García, you can switch on your audio, video, or the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Bhupesh, for the kind introduction, and thanks very much to the International Adsorption Society for the invitation. I'm delighted to be here and give this webinar that hopefully is of interest to the audience. So let me then just share my screen. Hopefully the audio is fine.
Yep, sounds great so far.
Fantastic. So can you please also indicate whether the screen is correct? Can you see my cover slide?
Exactly, yes.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. So then let me get straight away into the topic of my presentation today. And I'm going to be talking to you about what we have been doing over the past 4 years in terms of coming up with sorbent materials for carbon capture applications. And you see there in the title of my talk that we go all the way from system analysis down to density functional theory and back. So hopefully by the end of my presentation, you will understand the reason for this title, and hopefully I can give you an overview of our efforts on this space. So let me first of all activate my pointer. Okay, so then, firstly, I don't know how many of you in the audience might be familiar with carbon capture and geological storage, but that's what we are going to be talking about today. That's what I'm going to be specifically referring to when it comes to the application. So CCS, or carbon capture and storage, is referred to as one of the mitigation strategies that we need to consider in order to get to our net zero targets by 2050. And what CCS is mainly about making sure that the CO2 that is derived from anthropogenic sources, so CO2 that is emitted, for instance, from power plants, for other type of industries, instead of being emitted to the atmosphere, is captured in a CO2 capture plant, and then it will be further compressed, transported, and sent to geological storage. So the idea here is that instead of then sending that CO2 into the atmosphere, we just make sure that we separate it out from the flue gas or the industrial gas that is coming from, and then we put it somewhere safe and very far away from the atmosphere. So the way we do this then is with a series of CO2 capture technologies, and those are basically separation processes of different kinds. And let me then explain now a little bit what our vision was 4 years back in time, and also what the challenge was at that time. So it was clear then that we must transition, if we are to achieve our net zero goals, we must transition towards a world where we need to capture the CO2 from all the different sources that we have out there. So we have many different sources of CO2, and those sources are of different scale. They are located in different regions. And equally, once we separate the CO2 out of whatever the CO2 stream is coming from, we need to do something with that CO2. So we equally need to make sure that we match that source with a specific sink. And again, that will be very linked to the specifics of the region. So where you are in the world, that will dictate what are the sinks most available to you, and you will have to eventually match that CO2 source and sink combination. So then the question was, for a given source and sink of CO2, so for a given combination here of source and sink, what is the optimal CO2 capture technology, and in turn, what is the optimal material for that separation? And in this project, or in our work, we have focused on adsorption-based carbon capture technologies. Of course, in this audience, I don't need to explain what an adsorption-based process is made up of, but basically it's a cyclic process where the CO2 containing gas stream goes through a bed that contains an adsorbent material. So that CO2 is going to be retained into the material. Hopefully everything else goes through, and then by just switching the operational conditions of the process, we are able then to get the CO2 out of the bed and send that for transport and storage. So this is a cyclic process, and in a process of this kind, the adsorbent material that we pack in our reactors is at the heart of what we do. And it's extremely important to identify what's the best material for a specific process and for a specific application. So what's the challenge then? So, well, this is a challenge. What I highlight here in blue is something that was pointed out already back in 2017 as one of the main challenges for this type of technologies. And that is clearly no quick way to identify what processes and process conditions are optimal for a particular adsorbent to achieve the required specifications for a carbon capture application. So how to quickly assess whether a material is good or not for a specific carbon capture application. That was the challenge, how to go about that. So traditionally, this is what it has happened in the field. So we have on one side a huge amount of materials that are reported on a yearly basis. Beautiful examples of many materials that hold promise for carbon capture applications, and normally those materials are ranked based on very simple material metrics like selectivity, surface area, so things or metrics that we can calculate very easily from basic properties of the materials. So kind of the materials community have been focusing on that, whereas the engineering community, so people like me, we have been focusing mainly on doing all sorts of process modeling, process optimization to make sure that we come up with a process that is as cheap as possible. And therefore, we want to do that with those evaluations with materials that are already out there in ton scale and that we know everything about, so we can input everything we need in our models. So this kind of lack of integration between material science and process engineering is a clear gap of knowledge that hinders the realization of many novel materials and its progression from the lab scale to the commercial scale. So what we did then in the PRISMA project, and PRISMA stands for Process Informed Design of Tailor-Made Sorbent Materials for Energy Efficient Carbon Capture, was to come up with a solution to sort of bridge this, what is very well known as Valley of Death, and try then to integrate those two different worlds. And this is how we envision it. So we define what we call the stakeholder universe of carbon capture. So basically, for large-scale deployment of carbon capture technologies, we need to consider many different spheres. So not only the technosphere, and within the technosphere, we've got, of course, requirements from the CO2 source, also from the CO2 sinks. Also, we need to look at the materials, we need to look at the process, but we also have two additional spheres that are very important. The business sphere, so economics, are very important, especially when you want to make sure that that you deploy this at the commercial scale. You want to make sure that indeed the solution that you are proposing is competitive with what is already out there. But also the ecosphere. Okay, so here it is basically the environmental impact of what you are doing. We need to make sure that with everything we are putting in place, we are indeed capturing more CO2 than what we are emitting because of the operation of the process. And of course, all these spheres fall within what we call a social sphere that is not represented here, but it's very important. So social support is key as well to make sure that all these new low carbon technologies get deployed at commercial scale. So what we did in PRISMA then is that in order to address that challenge of integrating the molecular world with the engineering world, we basically put together what we call our PRISMA platform. So this is a technology platform that integrates basically all the different elements that we need to consider in a process. So all the way from the life cycle assessment, so the environmental aspects, to the techno-economics, to the process, and to the material. So this is an in silico platform that is built in Python, so open source code, and that interrogates the materials space and identifies what are the optimal materials for a given carbon capture application, or what we call a given case study. And the key innovation here is that the materials discovery process here is going to be driven by all the requirements from the higher level system. So basically, we understand first, we follow a holistic approach here, where we understand first our whole system, and then that translates into a series of key performance indicators that are going to drive all our materials discovery process at this very bottom layer. So we define a series of case studies to look into, and those case studies are defined by the CO2 source, the CO2 sink, and the region in the world where you would like to implement and deploy your carbon capture plant. And as you can probably realize very quickly, is that in order to put something like this together that covers all these different aspects, all the way from life cycle assessment to materials screening here, and molecular simulations at the very bottom of the platform, we need many different backgrounds, many different types of expertise that we need to integrate in order to do this. And what you have here on the left-hand side are the teams that are part of Prisma. So Professor André Verdou's team at ETH Zurich that looks after the LCA layer, Dr. Eva Sanchez from Solverlo Ltd that takes care of the techno-economics layer, my team at Heriot-Watt mainly looking after all the process modeling, also contributing to the TA, and then the group of Professor Bernd Smith at EPFL that looks after all the materials layer and the molecular simulations. So when we developed the platform, then we had to sort of decide on which materials we were going to be working with, and metal-organic frameworks were our choice. And the reason for that is because they are the ideal playground for us in the sense of the chemistry. So metal-organic frameworks, for those of you that are not familiar with them, are porous crystalline materials that provide us with a lot of diversity and variety in the chemical design space. Basically, in a MOF, you can change all the way from the metal, you can change the linker, you can change the pore topology, and all of those possible combinations give you trillions of materials for many different applications. So really a huge diversity when it comes to the chemistry that covers pretty much everything in terms of material properties. So that was kind of our reason to then decide on MOFs for exploring and developing the platform. And of course, with so much choice in terms of materials, we needed to come up with a method, with an approach that of course can't afford that with databases of hundreds of thousands of materials. So how did we go then about integrating all these different layers into our Prisma platform? What you see here in this slide is how the data flow within the platform. And let's focus first on the materials layer. So the very first thing that you hopefully that you realize from this slide is not to sort of, because it's a very dense slide, is not to focus on too much detail, but I wanted to mainly highlight that we've got a lot of databases, so we need a lot of data in order to be able to do this high throughput screening and incorporate all these different considerations into the screening process. And in the materials layer, the main database that we have is this material properties database. And for that, we can obtain the data from either molecular simulations. So you've got your crystal structure, and with molecular simulations, you get the data that you need, or you can just input directly experimental data into the platform, and then it goes into this database that fits into the process layer. So out of the platform, we get a total of 48 key performance indicators. So you see that from each of the layers, we've got a series of KPIs. And when we move from the material to the process layer, in this process layer, we require process and equipment data, and we also have the flexibility to work with many different process configurations and designs. So the platform has been built in such a way that it's as flexible as possible. So we sort of coded different modules to be able to plug in and out modules as required. So for instance, here at the moment, in terms of the process, we've got two different process configurations, a TSA, temperature swing adsorption 1, and a temperature vacuum swing adsorption 1. And of course, we can add as many as we wish, depending on the problem we are looking at. So then out of this layer, we get foreground data for the techno-economic analysis and again, process KPIs. In the techno-economic analysis, or in the TA layer, what it happens is that we basically, when we move from the process to the TA layer, we scale up. So we go from a column to a plant. So how many, we basically then calculate how many columns we need to process frames, etc. In here, we need a lot of information about the utilities that we have accessible. And this is a very important aspect into the platform, because depending on your CO2 source, you might have utilities available at the host plant that you can make use of to, for instance, get the heat that you require for the regeneration of your sorbent material. And if not, you then need to provide that heat from an external utility or bought that utility externally. Yeah? And then we've got also quite a lot of economic data, and both these utilities and economic data are region specific. So again, from the techno-economic analysis, we get foreground data that we need for the life cycle assessment and a series of key performance performance indicators. And then in the top layer, in our LCA layer, we take into consideration the full life cycle of the material and of the process. So not only the use phase or the carbon capture plant, but also the material synthesis and the material disposal are also considered. So really the full life cycle assessment, and again, very strongly linked to the region where you are in the world. So as I've mentioned, in total, 49 or 48, now I'm hesitating, I think it's 48 KPIs coming out of the platform. And many of these databases as well are linked to the specifics of the case study. So, so far then, what we have achieved, what we have done is we have screened a database of over 1,000 solid sorbent materials, and we have looked at different CO2 sources, different type of processes, different regions, and different utility systems. In total, 63 different case studies where we have combinations of all these 4 different aspects. So let me then just very firstly illustrate what we can do with the platform with just a specific case study, and this is what we call our base case for the discussions. So here we are capturing CO2 from a cement plant. So the CO2 concentration in the gas stream is approximately 20%, and the plant is located in the UK, and the CO2 is sent for geological storage in the North Sea. So we then screened our database of over 1,000 MOF structures, and I will also discuss a bit how we have benchmarked our results, the impact of the water on the gas stream, and the validation of the platform's predictions. So the very first thing that we did is that, well, we get, as I've mentioned, we get 48 key performance indicators out of the platform, and you can make use of each of those single KPIs for ranking the materials. But in order to sort of make some sort of a sensible ranking and simplify a little bit also the interpretation of the results, what we did was to identify what we call our reference KPIs. And these are the ones that are shown here on the slide for the different layers. This followed from a Spearman analysis where we identified basically the trends of the different KPIs. So what I want to say with that is that, you know, it's not a random selection. It actually follows from quite a detailed analysis on all the different KPIs from the platform. So then we selected from the materials layer the Henry selectivity, very basic metric that is very easy to calculate at the materials level, from the process, purity and productivity, from the techno-economic layer, the net carbon avoidance cost. This is an important one because we are able to indeed calculate this net, and it's important here to highlight this word, this net cost, because we have everything connected to the full life cycle, to the life cycle assessment of the plant. So the incorporating all the full cycle. That's why we can add this net at the beginning of the cost metric. And then at the LCA layer, we have chosen the climate change KPI, which basically accounts for the indirect greenhouse gas emissions and direct. So not only the direct emissions, but also the indirect ones that come from, you know, utilities and materials synthesis, etc. And then the second one we chose from this layer was the metals and minerals KPIs, which is an indication of the use of the metals and minerals in the process, and takes into account the availability of the metal and the mineral on the earth and its current mining rate. So then once we have our 6 reference KPIs, we looked at the ranking, in this case, again, for this specific base case study. And what you see in this graph is you see the ranking from 1 to over 800. So 1 is the best performer. And you have the 6 KPIs on the x-axis. So the exercise here was, okay, if we are then to make use of the Henry selectivity as our metric for ranking of materials, these 10 blue points here at the top indicate the top 10 performers according to the Henry selectivity. So what you can do then is that you can track down those 10 performers across all the other layers, across the KPIs that are derived from the other layers. And what you see straight away is that the ranking then really spreads across very differently. Yeah? And materials that perform very well here really can perform very poorly at other layers. For instance, the productivity is a bit all over the place, more towards the lower ranking space, and also the NCAC and CC are kind of all spread across the ranking. And in terms of the minerals and metals, some of them really perform very poorly here. So we can do the same exercise with by carrying out the ranking using other KPIs, and you can then track down the structures across the other layers, and you kind of see how that ranking changes. So really the key message is not straightforward to select the optimal material for a given application. You need to consider all these different aspects, and ideally we would like to have a material that kind of ranks nicely across all these different KPIs and kind of towards the top of this ranking scale. So also something that we can get out of these graphs, which we call line plots, very quickly is, if there is a problem with one specific aspect of the platform, that is pinpointed very quickly. So, you might have materials, for instance, that they rank very nicely across the material process and techno-economic layer, but maybe they rank very poorly here. So then by just changing, for instance, the metal and retaining the properties and the performance of the material, you can just get your ranking up there, and it is indeed a material worth considering. So again, very quickly, you can get a lot of information from all these graphs. So in those graphs, you see just the rankings. So, top performers versus bad performers. But of course, we have the values for all these KPIs. And this is exactly what we show, specific electrical energy here in the color-coded bar. And what we are interested in knowing is if our solid adsorbent-based carbon capture technology is competitive with the current state of the art. We consider the current state of the art for carbon capture as the MEA, monoethanol amine based technology. So is this a liquid or a solvent-based type of technology rather than a solid solvent-based one? And this line here represents where the benchmark lies at the moment for capturing CO2 from cement. So what you see then is that we've got a huge amount of materials that indeed outperform the benchmark. So it seems that there is a lot of potential for solid solvents then to make it into this type of carbon capture applications, because you can reduce the cost by as much as half. So it's indeed a very promising application for this type of systems. So something else we do is that, and in case that you're going to ask later, since I get asked this question, is what happens with the water, okay? So our screening studies, we started just assuming that we have a binary gas mixture of CO2 and nitrogen, which is, of course, not the reality. Of course, you can always pre-dry your flue gas stream, but that comes at a cost, which is normally quite large. Again, depends on the application, so that can be considered as well. But we know very well that CO2 and nitrogen are not the only components in our feed gas streams. One of the main components that bother the most is water. And what then we do is then we look at the impact of the water in the performance of the process. And we do that by basically looking at what we call the water resistance coefficient. And this is a metric that we calculate, and by comparing the working capacity of the material in the ternary mixture versus the working capacity in the binary mixture. So if that capacity is not, I mean, if the working capacity doesn't decrease by more than 30%, then we consider that the material is relatively okay underwater. So it's really a flag for us to further assess what would be the impact of the water in our process. So, of course, all of this is done, as I've mentioned, is done in silico, right, in a computer. And of course, the question is, okay, how good our predictions are? Huh? How can we be confident that everything that we get out of the platform is, makes sense and it goes indeed in the right direction? So we have then validated our predictions by inputting experimental data into the platform. You might remember from the previous data flow that I showed that you can get your material properties into the database by either molecular simulations or directly. You've got experimental data, great, you just input that and the platform runs with that. So this is what we did, and the very first material that we looked at was CALV20. I'm pretty sure that also the audience is familiar with this material. This is a moth that was developed in Canada, and it was actually scaled up and commercialized and tested in a cement plant. So it's exactly the same case study as we were looking at. So it's really a very nice example of, okay, let's look at how CALV20 performs here and whether we are able to predict the performance. So what you see here is that basically then we calculated the performance of CALV20 and our KPIs for from the structure, the simulated structure, and then with the experimental data. And you see the agreement here on the graph. So really very nice agreement. We were very happy with the results, clearly outperforming the MEA benchmark. And also when it comes to the cost, it really lied within the cost that was reported for this specific case with CALV20. You can do, of course, the same with any novel material that you have synthesized in your lab. One example is this MIP212 material that one of our collaborators synthesized. And in principle, it looked promising for carbon capture applications. So we just plug it in, and then we were able to identify very quickly the performance for this specific case study, of course, also for the others, but I'm just exemplifying this. So there are many novel materials out there that indeed hold promise for different carbon capture applications, and we are able to then see that very quickly. So as I mentioned, a few slides back, we have looked at a total of 63 case studies where we changed different sources, technologies, utilities, regions. I'm not going to go through the results of those case studies, but I'm just going to touch very briefly on one of the different perspectives, because as I have explained, you can look at, of course, all these results from many different perspectives or from many different spheres. So each stakeholder has a different view of the technology and is interested in different questions. So what we did was we questioned our results from those many different perspectives, and I'm just going to show here the chemist perspective. So basically, what would a chemist ask if we had all these results, and what type of questions the chemistry field would come up with? And these are just examples of 3 questions that they were very easy to identify. So basically, how does the selection of materials change depending on the source and the case study? So do we need to have different materials, or indeed is there the possibility that one material fits different uses or different case studies? What should be the innovation targets that as chemists we should focus on, and are there any common characteristics or material genes that are present in all top performing materials for a given application? So again, yes, questions that come up from the chemistry point of view, from the chemistry perspective, and we tried to answer these with the results from the platform. So in terms of the first question, okay, which material does the ranking and the performance change depending on the case study and on the technology? Indeed, it does. And this is what we show here, and this really motivates that need for that marrying of the material with the application. So what you see here is again the ranking on the y-axis, and 3 different case studies for 3 different sources of CO2, NGCC, very diluted stream, coal and cement, so 4%, 15%, 20% CO2, and then for a given technology that we sort of identified from the engineer perspective as the optimal one. And then what you see in the color coding is the absolute rank change between the rankings. So basically, the pink colors corresponds to materials that they don't change a ranking when comparing different case studies, and the blue color corresponds to materials that change their ranking more than 100 places. So what you see then in this graph is that when you move from an NGCC application to a coal application, then really the selection of material completely changes. You need a very different type of material. When the concentration in the flue gas stream is not that different, and we are moving into the high-end CO2 concentration here, then you might have a few materials here at the top that might perform relatively okay for both, but still you see how the selection really depends on the specifics of the case study. And again, all of this motivates this bespoke solution and this marrying of materials and process for a given application. Another question we had is like, of course, we get all this data out of the platform, and that eventually became really challenging when it came to the processing, storage, all sorts of challenges that we face along the project. But a very clear question that we had from the beginning is like, are we going to be able to identify from the top performing materials for a given application, what is common to all of them? Is there something there in the molecular structure that is common? So therefore, we can then focus our design to those features and make sure that the material has promise for that application. So that's what we then tried to do here. And for doing that, we followed a data-driven approach. So this is something that we have been embedding more and more into our platform because of the amount of data that we are handling and that we are processing. It's very good for machine learning approaches because indeed you can exploit that data or all the information contained in that data and try to understand and find trends and so on and so forth. So a data-driven approach was followed in this specific case study to try to identify those common characteristics of the top performing materials. And what we did was we developed a machine learning model where we predicted the NCAC KPI, so the net carbon avoidance cost, that's what the model is predicting. And the input to the model is just material characteristics or material properties. So that's the input, and all the way from there, we can predict the cost. So what you see here is the confusion matrix for our model, our ML model. So how would we are able to predict the results? And, you know, we've got a 74% accuracy and for the true match, which is pretty good. The same for the false. So we are pretty happy with the model and the predictive capability of the model. So once we had the model, then we were able to look at things like the feature importance. So what we did basically was our crystal structure. We translated that into a persistence image, and through those persistence images, we were able to analyze which atoms within the structure were responsible for, were the deciding factors for the performance. And those are coined with the term adsorbafor. That is something that we coined it back in 2019 in a previous study. But we were interested then in identifying those genes or common molecular characteristics that would make them top performers for this specific case study and basically outperform the benchmark. The result from this analysis was that those materials that perform better than MEA contain geometrical rods of metal atoms, or in other words, they contain stacked aromatic rings with a spacing of in between 6 and 11 angstroms. And on top of that, if they are also good performers underwater, that this distance then limits to approximately 6 angstroms spacing. We were also able to learn and understand which materials were not good underwater, and those would contain open metal sites and anions in the structure. So again, a very, very insightful model and terrific way to go all the way from the material characteristics to the cost and understand what it is that makes the material a good performer. So as I've mentioned, we have conducted 63 case studies, and what we have done in order to sort of facilitate the let me see if I can play the video. Yes, to facilitate the inspection and the observation of all these results is like we have developed a visualization tool where you see here all the database that we have used, the database of over 1,000 MOFs. You have the link to the publication here in case it's useful. You've got all the data for different properties, density, CP. You can select one specific structure and then go to its absorption properties, and you get the isotherms for both CO2, nitrogen. You can also download the properties if you are interested. So again, all the database, all the information contained in our database is in there for the community. You have also what we call our 3D plots. So in here, you are able to represent 3 KPIs out of all the ones that we calculate in the platform. You are able to select the specific case study, so the specific region, the specific source, the type of process, and then for each layer of the platform, you've got a drop-down menu where you can select as well the KPI that you would like to plot. You can also input a reference to see whether your materials are competitive or how they compare versus a specific reference, and straight away you can see the performance there. Something else that we have in our visualization tool is what we call our KPIs lines. So, and these are the line plots I showed earlier. So you just compare the ranking of materials according to different KPIs. Of course, you can select all the different KPIs in the platform from all the different layers. Not so sure whether you should see something. You will be able to see something with almost 50 KPIs here, but certainly that's possible. But you are able to straight away select the structure of interest. For instance, calc 20 here, and it's interesting how calc 20 for this specific case of cement ranks very nicely across all the KPIs, not at the very top, but very consistently across the different layers. And the latest capability that we have, latest feature that we have incorporated into the visualization tool is this feature where we can indeed upload the structure. You submit the structure to us, you say C file, and we then can run it through the platform, and as soon as it's run, you have straight away in a couple of hours how your material is going to be performing in the 63 different case studies that we have at the moment. So as soon as that's ready, the material is added to the database, and you will receive an email saying that it's ready to be looked at. So again, this is a tool that we have put together, and that we hope that it benefits the community, and we are really hoping that the absorption community engages with all of this. So, and before wrapping up my talk, let me then go back very quickly from the application to basic science. And something that it happened all the way from the very beginning till now during this project is that we faced a lot of challenges because of the integration of all those different layers. And it was really, when we started integrating things, when we started seeing loads of problems, and also the fact that we are doing these with databases of, potentially hundreds of thousands of materials, brings up a new series of problems and challenges that you don't face when you are only doing the exercise with 1, 3, or 5 materials. One of these one of these challenges, or one of these observations, was that, for instance, in temperature swing adsorption, when we calculate the energy requirement of the desorption step, we need to account for the heat of adsorption. So we need to overcome the heat of adsorption, and we of course need to we have a term there that accounts for the sensible heat of the sensible heating of the bed. So you need to heat your material from the adsorption step here to the desorption step there. So this calculation in the process layer requires the CP, knowing the heat capacity or the CP of your MOF material. Of course, when we deal with these large databases, we don't have the value of the CP for all the materials, mainly because that's something that is highly experimentally measured. So then what we did at the beginning of the project was then to assume a constant value of the CP, that it was kind of what we thought representative of most of the MOFs in the material space. However, we are, of course, very aware of the limitations of the different models that we have embedded in the platform, in the sense that we know which assumptions we make. And something that we've done a lot is we have carried out a lot of sensitivity analysis to understand what is the impact of our assumptions in the input parameters when it comes to the process performance. So indeed, we carried out sensitivity analysis around the value of the heat capacity of the MOF, and we saw that was quite an important one. So we needed to do better. We needed to do better than just having a constant CP in our screening studies. So one way to go about that is to then calculate this heat capacity with density functional theory, and by making use of the harmonic approximation, which is really this formula that you see here. So what you do in this calculation is basically you calculate the vibrational frequencies of each of the atoms in your MOF. And you see that your heat capacity is going to depend on those frequencies and also on the temperature as well. So basically, then you calculate your heat capacity as a summation of all those vibrational frequencies. And this is what you see here in this graph. You see the contribution to the heat capacity versus the frequency for different temperatures. So what we did then was to determine for each of the materials the number of times, determine for a MOF material the number of times the frequencies is observed, and we do that by displacing the atom in 3 different directions. That's how the DFT calculation goes. So you've got its atom that contributes with 3 frequencies. So basically we move it in the 3 different directions, and we calculate the energy, and that energy then is translated into the vibrational frequency. And what is called the density of states from the Hessian matrix. So what is also very clear, if you use a DFT calculation like this, is that the calculation is very much limited to materials that contain less than 200 atoms. The reason for that is because the calculation is of the order of n times to the power of 4. So very quickly, it becomes very computationally expensive. So that was a clear limitation when it came to, calculating CP with DFT. But indeed, this harmonic approximation is able then to calculate the heat capacity. We see here the calculation, how it goes for MOF 74, where you have two different types of metals, zinc and magnesium. Zinc is heavier than magnesium, and the contribution to the heat capacity is indeed higher. So we then applied these DFT calculations to the heat capacity, and we kind of validated the calculations with experimental data within a certain range of temperature. We were pretty happy with this agreement. It's as good as it can get. So then we moved on to the question, right? Okay, we can calculate heat capacities with density functional theory, and we can then make use again of data science to then try to come up with a model that predicts the CP of all potential MOF materials in all the databases that we are dealing with. So, but what we quickly realized is that because of that limitation of only being able to compute the heat capacity for those structures with less than 200 atoms, we didn't have enough data. We had only like a few hundred data points because of that limitation, and that wasn't good enough for a machine learning model. So the way that the lead author of this work came up with to sort of overcome that challenge was indeed extremely smart way. And it's like, instead of, in machine learning, you would normally machine learn your heat capacity, so for a MOF, a heat capacity, and so on and so forth. But we didn't have enough MOFs or enough calculations for enough MOFs. So then what Mohammed did here is like he machine learned not the heat capacity, but those vibrational frequencies that we had for all the different atoms contained in your MOF. So basically then each atom of the crystal is featurized to capture the similarities in the local chemical environment. So then we featurized the local chemical environment, and we encoded the atom identity, the local geometry, and the local chemistry. And what that gives us is like, again, then for a MOF, we had then many data points, because we are going to have many different local chemical environments that account for different metals, different linkers, etc. So we then needed just to make sure that we had local chemical environments that were representative of our MOF space. So then by doing this, we came up with predictions of the heat capacity with the ML model that indeed match those from DFT calculations. And what you see here in this graph are the predictions for the test set. So, and not also the predictions, but also the certainty of the predictions. So we were then very pleased with the model. And of course, the next step is always to validate that. So we go to the literature, and we extracted the very few experimental data points that we could find for CP values. And the first thing that we compare was those experimental values with the ML prediction. Of course, if the agreement is good, they would fall within the diagonal. That wasn't the case, so pretty disappointing at that time. Also, what we checked was where those experimental values would fall within the chemical space. So these gray cloud of points here represent all the CP values for the different for all the database of MOFs that we were dealing with. And you see that oddly they were kind of falling without the expected range of materials, which was kind of weird. So we then investigated further, and then what we found out is that the CP of these materials were measured, those CP values were measured with the solvent still in the pores, which is something that of course we don't have for carbon capture applications. So then we decided to synthesize the materials ourselves, but making sure that they were activated properly. We would measure the CP values, and then the picture changed completely. We could see how nicely the agreement was between the experimental values and the ML predictions, and all our experimental points were indeed within the boundary they were meant to be. So then this activation procedure seemed to prove very important when measuring CP values. And our main conclusions from the study were that, well, for zeolites, it's having a constant CP when we have zeolites in our databases is indeed a reasonable assumption, because you see that they are all more or less within the same range. But however, for MOFs and COFs, that's not the case. So our value that we were using initially in the platform for the CP, which is the one highlighted here in the horizontal line, was indeed too high for most of the MOFs that we were considering in the screening study. And if you then calculate the actual heat requirement, considering the actual CP rather than the initial one that we consider, this is what you get. You see here the actual value of the heat requirement, and this is the correction to the heat requirement versus the initial one. So here in color coding, you've got the different values of the heat capacity calculated by the ML model. And what you see is that for a few materials, those materials that are coded blue, the actual heat requirement was indeed higher than the one originally calculated with a constant value, so 10% higher. But for most of the materials, the actual heat requirement was indeed lower, and as low as almost half for some of them. So you see here, the heat requirements for the case where the constant CP was used, and you see how quite a few of those materials then change to becoming relevant or interesting when you indeed use the actual CP value. So again, this is just an example, or what I find a beautiful example of the type of questions and problems that we encounter when carrying out all this integration all the way from the life cycle assessment to molecular simulations, and the challenges when doing this high throughput screening. So what's next for us? You might have noticed that in some of my slides, you had the label of unpublished data. So all this data is gonna go out very publicly very soon. We think we are expecting that within literally the next few days. And the platform will be an open science platform. So we are hoping that this advances the field and accelerates the deployment of carbon capture technologies by making the platform available to the whole community. And we are also looking for extensions to the platform, of course, adding technology sources, things. And this is something that, because of the extremely modular nature of the platform, is relatively easy to do. So we are hoping to engage with the community to extend the platform and extend our models. Something that we are currently focusing on is in direct air capture applications. So our source there is fixed to DAC, and this is something that is funded by the Grantham Foundation, and we are very excited about. So we are extending the platform to DAC applications. And yeah, with that, I would just like to finish thanking, of course, all our funders, and last but not least, thanking the fantastic Prisma team and USORDAC team. So I have focused on this presentation on kind of the platform and all the work that we have been doing there, but there is also a fantastic experimental team that works alongside the modelers to sort of validate predictions and do all sorts of fantastic things as well. So experimental groups led by Professor Jeff Reimer at Berkeley and Christian Serre at CNRS in Paris. So to all of them, thanks so much for this massive effort. And thank you everyone for listening, and I would be happy to take any questions. Thank you.
Perfect. Thanks a lot, Professor Susana García, for the excellent talk. It was nice to know about the extensive work done by your group in exploring from the molecular level aspect to LCA as well. We have a couple of questions from our YouTube audience. The first question is from Yogashri. The question is, how do the energy values compare for NGCC TSA versus NGCC TVSA for the best material screened? And how do they compare with a typical MEA process?
So what we have observed is that, and again, that's something that you will be able to see very quickly through the visualization tool once it's available, is that the competitiveness of the materials, of the solid sorbent technologies, is more evident when the CO2 concentration is higher. So for the NGCC case and the coal case compared to the cement case, we were still able to identify materials that are competitive. Quite a lot for the coal case, not that many for the NGCC case. Still, there is a nice bunch of materials there that outperform the energy requirements of MEA. But what is clear is that as the CO2 concentration increases in your gas stream, the solid sorbents or solid sorbent-based capture technologies become more competitive.
Yeah, perfect. Makes sense. The next question is from Adam Ward. The question is, are equilibrium type process models being considered in the framework? If so, how was the TEA done and how accurate is it?
Sorry, the second part of the question?
Are there equilibrium type process models considered in the framework, apart from the detailed process simulations? And if the equilibrium type process is considered, how is the TEA done?
How is the what?
The economic analysis, the techno-economic analysis done for the equilibrium type model.
Yes, so all the analysis is done. We do the full analysis for all the case studies, all the way from life cycle, so the life cycle assessment to the techno-economic analysis process, everything. So in the first in these first case studies, we indeed have a thermodynamic based model. We have validated all our models in all our layers, and we are also looking into basically increasing the complexity of the models and checking whether that's worth or not. Of course, again, this is a high throughput screening, so you cannot do this to start with a full physical model, because that becomes really an impossible task. So then we started with thermodynamic-based models, and then we are making use of machine learning to incorporate complexity in the models, and then start adding a series of effects that we know might be very important depending on the case study. For example, now for the DAC case, we incorporate. We know that we need to incorporate a series of things to start with, because it's very important for the specifics of the case study. But the platform was built up to start with thermodynamic-based models, and of course, then the techno-economics are calculated. If the question, Adam, is how we were able to calculate techno-economics with a thermodynamic-based model, is by making assumptions in the cycle steps. So the timing of each cycle is calculated, assuming certain things depending on the step. And again, that's something that we have validated, again, a full physical model. So you can indeed still do it.
Okay, makes sense. The next question is from Norberto. The question is, how do you predict the performance of a PSA process? Have you considered PSA processes apart from PSA process?
No, we haven't. At the moment, what we have, the process configurations that we have included in the platform are temperature swing adsorption and temperature vacuum swing adsorption. PSA is something that hasn't been considered so far.
Okay. The next question is from Connor Cleaton. The question is, Calc 20 seemed to perform near the limit for the cement case study. It was more or less the best material. So what are your thoughts on the innovation potential here? Could there be any material innovation possible in the future?
Absolutely, yes. Absolutely, yes. I think that specifically for the cement case, you have seen how many points its point as a material outperforms the MEA benchmark. So again, by just looking at having this capability of understanding the performance at all those different layers gives you a very quick estimation of whether the material is indeed promising or not. And that's the idea. The idea is to help all of us, the community, to sort of identify innovation targets and move faster with materials that are promising, but when that screening is guided by the actual requirements of the process. So that's really the idea here.
Okay. And Connor also has one more question. Is it really necessary to consider a low-level KPI if a MOF performs well at the LC or TEA level?
I love the question, because the fact that we can compute all of that, what gives us is a lot of insights in terms of what is important and what is not important. But for instance, for us, indeed, the KPI that we make use of for the selection of materials is the net carbon avoidance cost. So cost is ultimately the most important thing, and because of that addition of the net, you also consider the environmental impact there. So you know, within that given KPI, you can come up with what are the most interesting ones. Of course, you can then, you know, depending on the case study, you might want to look at other KPIs. For instance, say that you want to capture CO2 from a ship, where it's important, you know, the space, the weight of your capture plant is important. So then the KPIs that guide your decision might indeed be different. So that's very dependent on the specifics of your case study. You really cannot have a universal answer for that.
Okay, and as a nice segue to that answer, there's a question from Yogashri again. The question is, what is the reason behind selecting purity and productivity as a process metric? Why not even consider recovery and energy and so on? Would the results change if you take recovery and energy into consideration?
Yeah, I mean, the results are, we've got the results for all of those. As I said, we've got 48 KPIs. So we've got the results for all those KPIs. We selected those 6 reference ones that we called based on a Spearman rank analysis. So this is a type of a statistical analysis that tries to identify the trends between the KPI values. So we did that analysis, and then we identify what are the KPIs in the different layers that kind of incorporate the main trends, and that's the reason for selecting those. And again, that's kind of motivated by the Spearman analysis, and that will be clearly presented so you understand better. I didn't have the graph with the Spearman analysis, but we do have a very nice graph that shows why those KPIs are not others.
Okay, makes sense. And there's a really interesting question from Mario Zorilla. Is the thermal stability of the solid sorbents considered in the project?
So stability of the material is something that we cannot predict a priori. Again, please keep in mind what we are doing here. And what we are doing here is that we are predicting the performance of a material that haven't even been synthesized. Or it might have been synthesized if what we input is the experimental data. But in many cases of those MOFs, you can have in silico structures or hypothetical structures that haven't even been synthesized. Therefore, stability is a property that we cannot know beforehand. You really need testing. You really need performance testing to answer the question of how stable the material is. We can, for instance, we have our methods to look at the stability in water and again this type of things, and we make use of data-driven methods for that. But for instance, when it comes to the stability in terms of the performance, we make assumptions again. And at the moment, the assumption we made is that we need to replace the material every 5 years. Again, that's an assumption, and that's something that we do quite a lot of sensitivity analysis around that, because depending on the stability, that replacement rate would be lower or higher. So, but that's something that you need to test. We cannot, unfortunately, predict how long a material is gonna last in a cyclic process. You need to have experimental data for that. So we make an assumption, and then we test the sensitivity of our results to that assumption.
Okay, that's good. There's a question from Anjana. The question is, how are the LCA cradle and gate boundaries decided in the Prisma project?
Yeah, so this is a cradle to gate type of analysis. So mainly there are 3 different phases considered in the LCA. And as I mentioned, we cover the full life cycle analysis. So we cover the material synthesis, we cover the use phase or the carbon capture plant, and then we cover also the material disposal, not only the disposal of our MOF, but also the disposal of our carbon capture plant. So cradle to grave.
Okay. And I had a quick question. So at the beginning of your talk, you had spoken about inclusion of water into our simulations and experiments because that's the reality. How difficult is it to obtain water isotherms through GCMC or DFT calculations? Were there any difficulties in obtaining them?
I think that anybody that is in the audience that has worked with water probably knows how much of a nightmare that is, both computationally and experimentally. So anything with water is difficult. I mean, the calculations, the molecular simulations are difficult, and experimentally, I worked many years and running breakthrough experiments, and as soon as you put the water in there, your life just becomes miserable. So it's challenging. The water, anything that has to do with water is challenging.
Okay. And there's one question from Nicholas Wilkins as well. In the simulations, we've considered CO2, water, and nitrogen. Like, how was the competition model? Was it through a traditional Langmuir isotherm, or did you have to use any complicated isotherms and stuff?
No, so let me first maybe clarify what's the mixture, how do we calculate the mixture equilibrium, mixture adsorption. So we calculate the pure component isotherms with molecular simulations, and then for binary calculations and ternary calculations, we do a IAS, so ideal adsorption solution theory. That's what we use to calculate the mixture predictions. And then for the water, a specific water flag, that we calculate that water resistance coefficient, what we do is a GCMC, so Grand Canonical Monte Carlo calculation, and at the adsorption conditions for the binary and for the ternary mixture. And then we calculate that ratio and we check whether or how much the capacity has been lost because of the addition of the water.
Okay, nice. Yeah, I think that brings us to the end of the question and answer session. There were too many good questions as well. Thanks for answering all of them.
You're very welcome.
Okay, I'll just take the screen back. Okay. Thank you, Professor Garcia, for your presentation, Sorbent Materials for Carbon Capture, from systems analysis down to density functional theory and back. We also thank all of our attendees for joining this webinar and hope it was both educational and enjoyable. An edited version of this webinar will be posted on the IAS YouTube channel and Bilibili with an announcement on the IAS Twitter feed. The hope is that the work discussed here today will be a useful resource for the adsorption science community in the future. The next confirmed IAS webinar will be given by Hyung-Woong Ahn on June 28th at 2 p.m. UTC, same time as today. Announcements regarding the next webinar and other IAS online events will be posted on our Twitter feed and through the IAS mailing list. With that, we thank you for joining us, and we hope that you will join us again soon.